Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Sophia, your host. In 3 years, more than 200 Ontario women were married against their will. That's a surprising finding of a study conducted by the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. The largest number of forced marriages was in the Muslim community. Why is that so? Does Islam sanction marriage without consent? Who bears responsibility for those who are forced into marriage against their will? With me is Dr. Shabir Ali from the Islamic Information Center. Dr. Shabir Ali, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
My pleasure to be on.
Now, this study shocked me, and it shocked me in two ways. I mean, I'm familiar with forced marriage, and I know that these cases do happen. But what was surprising to me is that a quarter of the individuals who were in forced marriages were between the ages of 16 and 18. And the second statistic that surprised me was that there were all these individuals who had lived in Canada for at least 7 years. And most of them had lived in Canada for more than 10 years. So it wasn't like they had just come to Canada and were perhaps bringing behind some of their cultural practices from back home. But these were individuals who were well versed with Canadian law and Canadian society, and yet they were still practicing forced marriages.
Some cultural presuppositions run very deep, and they remain with people even though these persons may have lived in another environment for a long time. Mm-hmm. They still carry with them those presuppositions that they have learned from childhood. This is what they lived with, they experienced, and to them, this is the truth. This is what they must do.
Mm-hmm. Now, another surprising aspect was that so many of the individuals were Muslims. Half of the individuals who were victims of forced marriage were Muslims. And they came from many different parts of the world. It wasn't like they came from one particular country and had a particular practice of forced marriage back home, perhaps. This was across the spectrum, many different Muslim countries. So perhaps you can comment on that.
Yes, of course the statistics do show that the practice of forced marriages come from a wide variety of cultures. But yes, your question is also pertinent that many Muslims are involved with this. And so we have to look at what aspects of the classical Islamic law may somehow contribute to people thinking that they can get their girls married off against their will.
Mm-hmm. Of course, not everything is because of Islam, right? It's not. There might be other reasons why they might have gotten into a forced marriage situation, but one of the aspects could be Islam.
Yes, there's a combination of things. Sometimes people are worried that their daughters may defame them, so they want to get them married off early, and even to somebody that they're not happy with, just simply to get it done with, so that there's no possibility that shame may be brought to the family. Sometimes there are financial aspects to this. A family may be poor and perhaps they're expecting some financial reward from a prospective groom, and they marry off for this reason. There may be immigration matters at hand. A family wants to migrate and sees the marriage of their daughter as facilitating their migration. Many different reasons. But then, what is there in the Islamic law or classical traditions that may contribute to this? These are things that we have to look at carefully, because obviously to marry girls off against their will is really contrary to human rights. Every human being likes to feel that he or she has a certain degree of freedom. And when it comes to one's marriage, you're going to live with a spouse for the rest of your life. It better be somebody that you're happy to live with. And it could be the best person in the world, but if you're not given a choice in the matter, then you may resent even something that is good. And so parents have to recognize that their children, whether boys or girls, do have their own choices. And those choices should be recognized and should be celebrated, in fact. And people should help their children to get married to persons of their own choice, and only offer advice and, if necessary, to intervene if the situation is so clearly detrimental to the persons at hand.
So is there anything within Islam itself that seems to allow for forced marriage? or for individuals to be married without consent?
To answer this, I have to answer from the point of view of classical Islamic law, and then think about how we may deal with those laws in our present context. Let me refer to two of the major schools of Islamic law whose law books I have consulted recently. One is the Shafi'i school. The Shafi'i school of law basically has it that a father can marry off his daughter if she is still a virgin, even without her consent. But if she has been married before, and then not without her consent. The Hanafi school of law says that if she is a virgin, her consent must still be sought, and she cannot be married without her consent. But even so, her consent might be given in silence. In other words, if she's asked the question, she doesn't say anything, she doesn't object, well then her silence is taken as consent. But if she had been married before, then not only is her consent necessary, but now still according to the Hanafi school, she has more right than her guardian or her father or her grandfather. She has more right than they do to marry herself off. So she can decide who she wants to get married, whether by their knowledge or their consent, it doesn't matter. She can get herself married.
So how can we understand these different strands within the Islamic tradition then?
These are different schools of interpretation, and in a school of interpretation there are great scholars who have looked closely at the text of the Quran, at the traditions reported from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the work of scholars even before them, and they have arrived at these specific rulings. But that does not mean that their specific rulings are carved in stone forever, because just by the very fact that you have different rulings is evidence that some human interpretation is at work. Some people interpret a thing this way and some people interpret it the other way. So we can always go back to these interpretations and ask, well, to what extent were the cultural, social, political, geographical, and tribal factors affecting the interpretation that were arrived at in the interpretations that were arrived at in the various schools. Definitely the scholars, great as they are, nevertheless were human beings as we are, and for that very reason they were susceptible to the kinds of influences that we're susceptible to as well. We see things happening around us, we respond to these things, and we see some injustice, we try to correct it. So what did they see?
So we know at that time that, for example, consent wasn't a big thing. People didn't think about the fact that they had to consent to everything. So did that influence the fact that, you know, a woman could be married off without her will?
Yes, I think what you're referring to is that in some tribal situations, the elder of the tribe determined things for the tribe, and the consent of individuals was not such a big thing. As is today in modern society, every individual is an individual, and the individual has to consent to everything. Otherwise, we can't do anything to an individual or with an individual without the individual's consent.
Freedom is very important to us today.
Exactly. So
it
was
might not have been an important value in the past.
Individual freedom, that is, in the past. It was more like tribe solidarity and group cohesion and so on. And so the orders came down from above, and people just simply felt it their obligation to follow. And so that had a reverberating effect within the family as well. In the family, there was the head of the family, usually the man, and whatever he said was passed as law. So if he decided to marry his daughter to somebody else, then the daughter just simply obeyed. Or he might have married his son also to some girl, and the son just simply had to accept that, whether he liked it or not.
Yes.
And now individual freedom is very important, and we need to recognize that. We need to see the Islamic law as doing justice in its initial situation. If the same law is doing justice today, well then that's what Islam is about. Then it should be applied because we want justice. That's the objective of the Islamic law. But if that same Islamic law is not producing the resulting justice that it used to produce because the situation has changed, well then we need to look back at the law and see how to reformulate it. And reformulate it, we will not be wanton in that we just abandon everything, but we go back to our sacred traditions and we ask, what is the objective here? And are there some neglected pieces of the tradition?
Are there some neglected pieces?
Well, yes. There is a mention that a woman came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and said to him, Messenger of God, my father married me off to a man, and I want to know, do I have the right to cancel this marriage? And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said yes. And the woman said, well, I don't want to cancel the marriage, but I just wanted it to be known for the record that a woman does have this right. And this here is a neglected piece of tradition, because what came to be emphasized is another report which says that there is no marriage without a guardian or without a wali, and that's usually the father or the grandfather. But mind you, this can extend. If the father or grandfather are not around, then it could be the woman's brother. And if the brother is not around, then the brother's son, which means that the woman might be subject to being married off by her nephew.
What would you say to an individual, or to an individual who wants to get married, or to people who want to see their relatives or sons or daughters get married? How do they engage with the Islamic tradition but do it in a way that is in keeping with Canadian law?
Well,
Canadian values.
Yes. Well, it's not so much that that the Muslim would think that I have to modify the law because of Canadian values. The individual Muslim wouldn't be thinking of it in that way. If the individual Muslim is trying to be righteous and pious, what the individual Muslim usually thinks of is that I want to conform to the Islamic law regardless of the situation. But Muslim scholars who know the basis of the Islamic law and they recognize how law is formulated over time, and they know the degree to which human interpretation has gone into the law, it is the responsibility now of the Muslim scholars to show the average Muslim that by conforming to important Canadian values and Canadian law, they will not be violating the basic structure of the Islamic law.
Have they done that in the case of forced marriage? Have these scholars come out and said anything?
There are often sermons, khutbas, some pieces of writing and public lectures and so on in which scholars speak about this, and they show this to be a problem. And they show that this is not acceptable to force their children into marriages. But I believe that more needs to be done in this regard, in that we have certain classical law books. If somebody wants to know what is the Islamic law on a subject, they consult these books. And they usually hefty volumes. It is one of the crying needs of our present time that the Muslim scholars need to produce handy reference books of the same sort of volume as the previous books, but dealing with the Islamic law as it relates to the present context, and showing Muslims, the average Muslim, how they can live in their present context without violating any of their local laws, without scandalizing the societies in which there are certain cherished values, and at the same time they can be faithful to the Islamic tradition. And that, as I said, is one of the crying needs of our present time, that such law books need to be produced.
Having said all that, do you think it's fair to come out and say that Islam prohibits forced marriages, or is that too strong a statement?
Well, when we say Islam, then we are referring to a certain interpretation of Islam. And I would say on my interpretation of Islam, forced marriages are contrary to, I would say that forced marriages are contrary to my interpretation of Islam, because forced marriages usually mean that you're confining a person to a life of misery. That is contrary to the principles that I understand to be Islam. And I would speak now more universally and say that it is universally recognized that Islamic law has as its primary objective the outcome of justice. And if justice is not being assured, then what you're thinking of to be Islamic law is incorrect. It's not Islamic law. And then I would say that that's not just my interpretation. That should be the interpretation of every Muslim scholar.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for your time, Brother Shabir.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break when we return. The Quran's peaceful image of the prophets.